Brazilian Grand Prix 2024 is in the bookshelves, and so is the World Drivers' Championship. But after watching 8 hours of racing on a Sunday, I don't know if I have it in me, but we have a lot to discuss. So here we go. Okay, Shaz. So this was quite the race weekend, and it feels like the season is essentially over, especially if you were tracking the Lando versus Max battle. But I thought that on a day where there was so much happening, we could start in the most obvious place by congratulating Alpine for a double podium, man. I mean, would you know it? Did you have that in your bingo card? Like I looked around, I had nothing like that.
Did I have the ninth fastest team on the grid achieving a double podium at the Sao Paulo Grand Prix? No, I did not. That was a
Did not.
surprise.
And
Um,
I know Max is going to be happy, but I think the Alpine team couldn't be happier from this weekend. I mean, they jumped to sixth in the rankings. That's a $50 million payout, evidently. So that's no
yeah,
joke, man.
and poor old James Vowles is going to be sitting there furiously bashing his calculator to work out what the heck he has to do next to upgrade his Excel spreadsheet.
Actually, yeah. If I'm Paulo
Franco,
Science,
like both his drivers in the wall with massive damage. His future driver in the wall
all of
causing
them,
safety
they
car.
were all in the wall.
And the team that he's up against, finishing on the podium
It's
times two. It could not have gone worse for Williams this weekend. Sorry, James.
No, I really couldn't. But I mean, I think the prize on this particular occasion for this race goes to Lance Stroll, man. I mean, there is nepotism has been undefeated since the beginning of time. And yet again, we see a driver that deserves to be nowhere close to the grid, kind of be there and then just muck things up. I mean, I don't care which camp you fall in, whether you're in the Lando camp or a Max camp, but that should not have been the start of the race. That absolutely should not. That nuked the race in many different ways. But good God, what are we going to do about Lance, Chez?
I don't know. I usually apologize for my Lance slander on this channel, but I feel like there's no point. He's so disengaged from anything Formula One, even when he's in the car, that I feel I have no risk of him actually watching me say this, but he is a complete waste of space in that car. It's just awful. Like there was a part of me that felt like he beached the car on purpose because he just couldn't be bothered.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about the number of drivers that are waiting an F1 seat, the long list that we keep debating about week in and week out, I mean, it is just impossible to imagine that someone is occupying that space that couldn't
Yeah.
be the least
The,
bit interested. I mean, I vote for FIA giving Lance Stroll the wrong time for the race, like for him to just show up like 4 hours after the race is over and just say, "Oh, sorry, man," or just like let's guarantee some points to him and say, "Hey, Lance, if you show up, don't show up for this race, we'll give you 5 points and we'll call it a day. Let's just do that."
yeah, I mean, the only thing that I worry about is that he actually decides to call it a day, and Daddy Stroll also goes, "Well, if my son isn't driving in Formula One, I'm pulling the plug on the Aston Martin project as well." That would be a travesty. And if Lance Stroll is only in F1 to ensure that we have a competitive Aston Martin team, begrudgingly, that's good enough for me.
Oh man, then in that case, your guy Adrian Newey is going to be the guy running the team too, because he's got ownership at stake in there too. Don't.
Yeah, oh, he's gonna love it. He's gonna love it.
Uh,
Listen, Amar,
yeah.
no one came here to listen to us talk
Are you
about
sure?
Alpine and Lance Stroll. I mean, even Lance Stroll doesn't want to
Chess,
sit and listen
that
to us talk about Lance Stroll.
I agree with you, and let's get to the main topic. But good God, 7 hours of Formula One? I mean, come on. I honestly like just cancel the damn qualifying. I mean, really, it really didn't matter at the end of the day. Look, Max was he started 17, he would have started 20. What difference would have it made?
Mate,
He would have
well, he
been
wouldn't have. They would have used sprint qualifying, wouldn't they? They would have used sprint
whatever.
qualifying.
Like what? It
Surely.
doesn't matter. Even if they put them 25th, he was going to win that race. So it doesn't matter. Like
Ooh. Okay, so
so
here we
there
go.
you
Now,
go.
now we're gonna get
Now we're
into it
getting
a little
spicy.
bit, right?
Okay,
So this is the bit you've been waiting for. We're gonna talk
this
about Max.
this is the bit, and you'll be really proud of me because guess what a 7 hour race weekend does to me? It makes me make notes. So
You got your
something
notepad out.
wild. You wouldn't
Can I
know
see your
that.
notepad?
I do. I have a notepad here. Look at this. It's well written.
Oh,
It's only half a page or whatever. Come
wow.
on, don't mock me, man. Uh,
7 hours of racing, half
I want to go
half of a
through.
page of notepad.
And you and I have not talked for 2 days since the race ended, and no wonder we're
Unbelievable.
this late because, good God, I really felt like I had to do something not related to F1 after watching the qualifying and the race back to back. But let's get into this, Shaz, because I think that the topic of the town is really whether Lando sort of gave this up again, right? And
What? That's not the talk of the town. The
that
talk of the
is
town
really
is
is.
how awesome was Max?
Of course, he is awesome. Come on, I'm being tongue in cheek
Uh,
here.
I think before we start talking
Let
about
me do
Lando,
my
and
thing.
I know you want to, but we cannot ignore Max.
Of course not. We're not going to ignore it. In fact, I have made a list of the top 5 reasons why Lando Norris was not responsible for losing this race and finishing where he did, and ergo effectively losing his world championship title bid. Like that's pretty much it, right? So let's go through that. Let's go because number one on that list for Lando not being responsible is Max Verstappen. I mean, we have come on time and time and time and time again. Those of you that haven't watched our episodes on Max, just go back, click a few episodes back. We have given him all the praise in the world. And I think Imola comes to mind most recently because that seemed to be that signature win on a day where he didn't need to be the one winning that race. But this race even tops that, right? To start P17, making his way through traffic like it was just like a walk in the park or something, and then eventually just being there smack dab in the middle of leading the race, only halfway through the race, mind you, by the way, at that point still a
43,
lot to
lap
play for. So
43.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
Okay, can I
that
ask you
was
a
quite a
question
week.
then?
So yeah, go ahead.
So, Ahmad, do you think this was, as Christian Horner put it, Max's Donington 1993? Just for the avoidance of doubt, Donington 1993 is the race where Ayrton Senna um, started what ninth or 10th on the grid, and by the end of the first lap, he was overtaking Alain Prost for the lead of that race, a lead that he would not give up for the rest of that race.
Okay. So first of all, you know me. I don't like doing this stuff largely because it takes away from enjoying the moment, right? And uh,
Now here we are.
I'm going to say no. But the only reason I'm going to
Oh,
say no is because I think that this race will stand as an example in and of itself. That's the reason I'm saying no. What Max did was just amazing. He was also aided by some good fortune too, which, by the way, does not discount his racecraft, his results in any way, right? Fortune favors the brave. He did get a couple of breaks, but he was going to win that race anyway. I mean, there were like 17 fastest laps in there. So that's why I want to
wow.
go through the list here.
Okay,
So, so
let me
stick
put
with
that
me.
question to you slightly differently, Omar. Like, do you think, because I think that every absolute GOAT level driver has a wet weather drive in their library
Yeah,
somewhere,
sure.
right? So Senna had Donington 93
Amy.
and Estoril 85, was it? Estoril 85. And Schumacher has Spain 96, Lewis has Silverstone 2008, and perhaps even Brazil 2016. Was this Max's signature wet weather
Yes, if
drive?
if that's
It
the
was.
question you're asking, it absolutely was. It
Okay.
really was,
And
and you have to look at
it
the
trumps Brazil 2016 for him, does it?
it does only because of the stakes that were involved. And look at what happened earlier in the day too. I mean, he was, you could argue, hard done by, I mean, it's hard to believe there was a qualifying earlier in the day too, right? But his starting grid position was largely determined by, again, the FIA being at the FIA. So given where he was at, and he himself, talked to the fact that he was ready to break things in the garage. He's gonna get ready to destroy it, and then he changed his mind and came in with a really positive mindset. And oh, by the way, while we've been critical of him for the last couple of weeks, this was the race again that reminded us of the greatness that is Max Verstappen. So I'm not in any way surprised that that would happen, although the circumstances were very much up against him. And then remember, in a wet race, anything can happen. This year, for some reason, no two drivers have sort of taken each other out of the race, unless it's been Max and Lando themselves, right? But in a wet race, you would have said the chances of somebody, rear-ending him or whatever, taking him out would have been great. But he managed to do what
Well, he
exactly
started
what he
so
did.
far back that there was nobody behind him to rear end him. That was
True.
the problem,
That's
wasn't
true.
it? But
That's true. Or spin him out. You know what I mean, though. Anyhow,
listen, I want to be in absolutely no doubt about what we were saying. This was a superlative, era
absolutely.
defining, driver defining drive by one of the greatest drivers that has ever plonked their bum in a Formula One car. I cannot believe that it's taken me till the end of 2024 to say this, but I'm saying it right now. But even with that, this drive does get split into two
Yeah.
halves for him. Um, and the first half of it was where I think he made his money. The second half of it did owe a little bit to luck, but that doesn't take away from what he
Absolutely. Man.
did in
Yeah.
the first stint, in the first part of that. Because to get past number one, six drivers on the first lap, to then take Lewis Hamilton into the first corner on your second lap, and then by lap 11 be up to fifth from 17th in the rain with no one pitting, no one else falling off the road in front of him, particularly some of the moves he was pulling off, especially that move on Piastri, were unbelievable. And the lines that he was taking, if you haven't if you haven't watched a wet race before and you don't understand sort of what the big guns do, watch what Fernando did in 2006 in Hungary and watch what Schumacher did in 1996 in Spain. Those races are available on F1 TV. You should go and watch them. They are must watch. The idea is that rather than sticking to the standard racing line that they were taking through free practice and sprint qualifying, they'll come off the racing line to avoid the rubber that normally you would want to be on because it provides you grip. But if you watch what Max was doing out of turn three, the Costa del Sol, Curva del Sol, every lap he was taking a wide line, whereas everyone else was taking the inside line. And the inside line was covered in rubber. You don't get the traction in the wet off the rubber because it gets slippery. So you want to avoid that and take the wider, non-rubbered in line because it gives you massive traction. That's what Max was doing time and time again. It gave him all of the traction he needed. And it gave him the passes that he needed right up until that fateful pass that he made on Esteban Ocon for the lead after the second safety car. I cannot reiterate how good of a drive that was. That was right up there with some of the best wet weather drives of all time.
I think the beauty of this is that if this was even like the second race in the season, right, where there are no it's not consequential in the scheme of the championships. I think that by itself makes his race amazing, right? Like you take everything out of it and just say this is just a race, somewhere earlier in the calendar. Amazing. But on top of that, just think about the stakes that he had, right? Because
Mm.
what we knew coming into this weekend is he couldn't afford to take a point swing because the next three tracks are arguably going to be in favor of, I think, Ferrari probably in Vegas, but then the next two are pretty strong McLaren holds. And really, if you look at how the sprint race went, which feels now like an eternity ago, McLaren had it, right? Whether you would argue if Lando is better than Oscar or not, whatever. The reality is that in the dry, McLaren's had it. So we knew coming into this weekend, and Max himself alluded to the fact that he knew he was going to lose some points. The goal would have been just let's minimize it. Let's walk away maybe by losing maybe 8 or 10 points at worst, or no more, right? But to kind of pull off what he did, and none of it felt risky, right? None of it felt
It
like he
just
was doing
felt
something out of
safe.
the ordinary. That's
Yeah,
just it. That's just it. So when
it felt
all the
so
stakes
easy.
are
Mm.
against you, right? When the day hasn't gone for you, when you have two damn restarts, race restarts, and then everything that happened in the race,
Yeah,
like just to
that's
kind of keep the,
mate. Oh, that's a brilliant point because I was thinking back to watching Lewis's race in 2008, and he was coming through on a wet track on Inters,
right.
trying to make up places. He needed to finish fifth. I remember like every move he had to take Fisichella in his Force India into turn one. And man, it was bum clenching time. Like I was properly like, oh my God, is he going to fall off the track doing this? He didn't, but I never had that fear at all with Max. Every move he made, even that move from a million miles back to take Oscar into turn one, you just thought if he dies for it, he's going to make it. And other drivers did just get out the way for him, but I feel like they were taking a different line anyway, a less optimal line, because Max knew where the grip was, and he was just putting his car in the right places to make the time up. I have got another question for you though. Can I ask it? Does Max Verstappen win that race without the red flag?
Um,
Just while you're thinking, I'll explain why that's a
yeah.
question. Yeah. So,
Right.
end of the first stint, Nico Hulkenberg beaches his car on the outside of turn one. A VSC is called. Uh, Sergio Perez comes in. A few of the back markers come in, get their tyres changed. Charles Leclerc has already come in and changed his tyres even before the VSC. But Lando and George both come in just as the VSC is ending and get their tyres changed onto used Inters. Max, Ocon, and Gasly all stay out. Then we have a safety car because the conditions get wet, more wet, which is probably why George and Lando went on to new Inters. It makes or change their tires. It makes sense to do that because in wetter conditions you want those tires. But because it got wetter, we got a safety car. Then Franco Colapinto puts it in the wall. We get a red flag. Max, Pierre Gasly, and Esteban Ocon all get a free tire change at the red flag stoppage and are still ahead of Lando, George, and the rest of them. They're in the podium position where everybody else is behind. Without that free tire stop, without being in that position because they'd stayed out a bit longer, does Max win that race?
Okay, so the answer to that is yes. It's simply, here's why. Just look at how many fastest laps he put, right? On this day, Red Bull was the quickest car. Given the weather conditions, given exactly where they were, he was going to do that. Yes, he was going to be there. I lost my train of thought.
Why was he not going to do that? Why did he not then overtake Leclerc when he was in that little train of cars from lap 11 onwards? Why was he
I,
not able to get past them?
I think he was going to go ahead and overtake Leclerc because again, I think on this day,
Yeah, but he had to go at Leclerc and got
Ferrari,
rebuffed.
yeah, but he would have eventually gotten there. Like it did take a
But
little
then
bit.
he would have
But he
would he
would have.
then have eventually got past Lando and eventually got past George.
Yeah, look, I think that there is you have a valid point in that I want to kind of go back and revise my point now.
See, I've been wrestling with this question all day, and my heart, because I came out of that so pumped. I was like, man, Max drove an absolutely amazing race. That he's got past Esteban Ocon. He's just putting in fastest lap after fastest lap after fastest lap. But while he was putting in those fastest laps, it was on a dry track, and Esteban Ocon was also putting in, um, personal bests throughout that segment as well. Whereas Lando and George were already behind. There was no movement further forward. There weren't any major overtakes after that. You saw how hard it was even for Lewis to get past Liam Lawson late in the race. So there wasn't any further
So
movement forward. So
yeah,
that's why I'm like, if it hadn't been for a red flag, if he hadn't been at the front already,
yeah. I
having made
mean,
that decision to stay out, would he have actually made it out? And let's not forget that before the second safety car, Ocon was actually moving away from Max while Max was
yeah, he
repairing
was.
his tires and
I
stuff.
think. Well, I think this is where you can say that there was some luck involved in winning the race, right? I think that would be a fair assessment. You also have to put yourself in that position, and he did, and Red Bull as a team did that. But I think that's fair. Look, in a race like this, where there are things that are so dynamic, the weather condition changes. When you stop for a little bit, there's changes in weather condition too. So there is a lot going on, right? So it's a little bit of a rolling the dice kind of situation, right, in there. But I do think there was some egregious mistakes on McLaren's part too that I want to get to.
Yeah.
But I
Sorry,
think I
I've
think that's a fair thing to
completely.
debate. I think that's a
I've,
fair thing to do. But let's
yeah.
just close it out by saying, look, Max is Max. This is, in my opinion, this puts him in the Mount Rushmore, and we can have that debate later on. But this is sort of one of those things
Top
where you kind of,
four. top
Now,
four of all
top
time.
four, top four, and this Ford championship, I think, is arguably, and we'll come back to it later, but arguably even better than the first one, and we'll have to kind of leave it for another day.
Oof.
Put it in the things to be pondered on file, Shez. Let's do that for
Okay.
now, and then we'll debate it. Now,
Yeah,
I
we'll
want to get
definitely
to
have a
my
chat about that.
second reason why
Yeah.
Lando was not responsible for
Yeah.
squandering this lead, if you will, and that is McLaren, and we were just talking about them. McLaren's decision, and I too went back and watched the race, right, was just subpar. It really was. I'm not going to fully blame them for it because in a dynamic weather condition type of race where there's so much happening so quickly, there's things, people are going off track, there's a safety car, there's a virtual safety car, there's a full safety car, and then there's Hulkenberg doing his thing. Like it's just kind of all over the place, right? But I think McLaren have shown this inability to get it right more often than not. I think back to Silverstone as a great example of that. And let's talk about this race. You just said you talked about Max sort of being ahead, right? Because both Russell and Lando pitted, and effectively they gave up track position. This was not the race to have given up track position, Ches. And you and I have argued offline about this, but I do want to kind of take it further.
Mm.
Lap 27 is when Charles Leclerc pits. I think maybe he's 26 when he pits. And then there's a radio from Lando's engineer. What's his name? Will Joseph, I think, right?
Will
Is it
Joseph,
Will
yeah.
Joseph?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Will Joseph.
He is telling, I mean, Lando's asking for a tire change, and he's effectively telling him that, look, Leclerc pitted and he's going nowhere with those new inters, right? And so when you're ahead, right, that's the thing that you wanted to keep in mind. I agree that the conditions got a little bit worse, right? But to that point, and even George Russell confirmed this, he was telling his engineers, right, that he didn't want to pit, he wanted to stay out. And they too made that same error. Now, look, when you're in the lead of the race, and when you have, if you're Lando Norris, you had one car ahead of you, and you have your rival behind you. You're in the best position that you can be because what you can do is you can look ahead and see what's happening to George. And George was fighting for a raceman, and I think a raceman was on for him if the conditions had persisted. Listen to what Red Bull and GP and Max's communication too. They're saying the exact same thing I just told you, Shez, which is, look, if the conditions worsen, then there's going to be a safety car, in which case there will be a neutralizing of the field. And look,
The
at that,
safety car in itself wouldn't have been enough, I don't think. It
it
needed a
wouldn't have
red
been enough,
flag.
but they would all be in the same window, right? Like, look, you're again.
But then he doesn't make any gains any further forward, Max, does
It
he?
doesn't matter, Shaz. You're defending against the guy behind you. And also when the conditions get worse, by the way, you would agree that either there's a safety car or there's a red flag. There's a high chance of a red flag
Yeah.
because we had seen that happen
Okay.
all morning long. So
Okay.
if you're McLaren, you do not need to give up track position. You just simply don't forget even competing against Max. You did not need to give track position to Russell at that point. You could have seen what he did and done the exact opposite.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
all.
So my counter to that is it's much easier to make a decision
Chaz,
to do
also, they're pitting right as the virtual safety car is ending, and they knew that coming ahead. You can see the onboards from Hulkenberg. You can see what's happening there.
But they're not looking at the onboards from Hulkenberg, though, are they?
Why would you not? He's the stop car that's causing the virtual safety flag.
Yeah, but they're also looking at that's not how they decide when the VSC is ending, though. Right?
That's not,
for
but
them.
no, Shaz, everyone knew that. I mean, if you were listening to commentary then, you knew that it was going to be ending soon. As soon as Nico started moving again, you knew that the virtual safety car was ending. This is not, I mean, this is me, an armchair enthusiast sitting at home deciding that. Like they can see this data. You're telling me they didn't see that?
Yeah, yes, correct. Because they're not looking at the world feed necessarily. They're looking at their own telemetry and their own information, their own data. But let me come back to your other point, right? Yes, I think the VSC, I think the timing of their stop with regard to the VSC was inadequate. I don't think that was well played. I totally agree with you. But that was the same for Lando as it was for George. They both came in at the same time. But in terms of the other side of this, there's two things here, right? Number one, as you say, the conditions changed. So while the track was drying, being on used inters was fine. That was, in fact, the optimal tire to be on because as they wear down a little bit, they get a bit more slick. You get those slicked immediates, and they're a bit better. They give you better purchase with the track. But if the rain starts to come down harder again, which it did, then you're on the wrong tire. And that's what the drivers were responding to. We have always said, even when Lando was making calls in Sochi 2021, we were saying you have to listen to your driver. If the conditions change, listen to your driver about what tire you need to be on. And Lando was saying, look, it's going to get wetter. I want to be on a better tire. Now is the time to change. If we do it, we'll get ahead of Russell. Mercedes were then listening to what Lando was saying and then did the same thing, even though George was telling them not to. But I think it made sense for them to do that if you understand why they were doing it. Heavier rain, newer inters makes sense, gives you better purchase, gives you better lap time, allows you to stay on the track. It's much easier for Max Verstappen, who's behind and in that specific scenario has less to lose, to make the opposite decision. They go in, we stay out. That's absolutely what happened.
That was
And
10 seconds. He
they
had
were
a
then
10-second
sitting
lead.
there.
Yeah.
They were then sitting there going, please, please let there be a red flag, because the safety car wouldn't have done it. And how could you predict that Franco Colapinto was going to punt it in the wall? I don't think
No shit.
McLaren could take that gamble, which is why they did what they did. And in hindsight, it's super easy to make that call. But in the moment, I was thinking, yeah, it makes total sense to go onto the Inters
No, it
because that
wouldn't
was
have
the
made
thing to
sense.
do.
Can I tell you why? The gap to Max behind was 10 seconds. They could have waited one more lap to see if he was going to pit. They could have waited. They had enough time to make sure
Yeah.
that they didn't lose. And this is my contention. Forget the race win on 1 second, because that doesn't even matter at that point. You know Max is charging. You've also seen, by the way, you have evidence of a Ferrari putting on new inters, not being able to make an impression. So
After
you have
one
to do that
lap,
math.
after one lap only. One lap only.
I mean, the Ferrari was not able to make an impression throughout the race, but yeah, that's neither here nor there. I mean, look, they had enough of a gap to Max to make sure that they could have responded had Max pitted, and then at least the two of them would have been closer. You
And
knew.
the other thing is that Red Bull had more information than McLaren and Mercedes did, right? They had more information. Perez had already pitted under the VSC. They'd already taken his tyres off, and Red Bull had seen that the wear wasn't too bad. So actually, they had the information to tell Max, actually, it's fine to stay out for a bit longer. McLaren and Mercedes did not have that information at hand.
And
So when they're sitting there going that it's getting worse, the
I would
conditions are
have
getting
agreed
worse.
with you, except if you heard the race leader say he wanted to stay out there and he was so adamant about it. I mean, that told you everything you needed to know. And those two were not pushing each other so
Mate,
hard that they wouldn't
I
have
think
driven
George
that.
makes decisions that are slightly rash sometimes. And if he had fallen off the road on those used inters, we would have been sitting there going, "What the heck are you doing?" Right?
Yeah,
And it was a 50-50 thing that one of those two things was going to happen. And as it was, Franco Colapinto did punt it in the
once
wall,
again a Williams.
which was a possibility for any of those drivers to do. So I take your point. In hindsight, yes,
But that's my
a
point,
complete
Shez.
balls up.
When it comes to these 50-50 calls, when the conditions are against you, some of it is luck, but some of it is also
Mm.
instinct, right? And McLaren have shown consistently that they just don't have, they're not falling on the right
Yeah,
side of it. Now you
yeah.
can say it's
I
luck,
don't disagree
but I
with
mean
that.
this has kind of been the case, and not being strong enough. Anyway, we can move on. So
Okay.
the third factor I wanted to put up, which I think is not insignificant, having thought about this through, right? To your earlier question of would Max have been able to win the race if the red flag had not come out. I think the weather played a big role, not necessarily and only during the race, but in the way the cars were set up. So this again slightly goes back to my last point, which is McLaren not making the right decision. They opted for the high downforce setup, which seemed like a great idea. But I think what you saw as the race play out and the rain sort of drying out is that the McLaren just didn't have any pace. They just didn't have
Mm,
it. And I don't think they're the only ones who got it wrong. I think Ferrari to a certain extent with car. And look, it's easy for me to be critical about that, but this was a sprint weekend with a lot of cancellations, and they had started their day on Sunday at 4 a.m. But
yeah,
with qualifying, right? So I think it's easy to have predicted it, but I think that was the gamble that went wrong, which I don't really blame them for fully.
yeah.
But they opted for that high downforce setup, which they could have gone with a little less downforce and they would have been more competitive. And that would have maybe given Lando a chance to make up those positions at the end where he really couldn't make an impression in the end. So, the weather did kind of play a role in that regard. But I don't know what you think there.
I think that the high downforce wing made sense if
It was going
Lando had
to.
kept the position at the start of the race. Because I think if he had kept that position at the start of the race with that big fat rear wing, he probably would have waltzed off into the distance and made Max's life much harder. Despite Lando saying that if Max had started at the front, he would have lapped all of us. So the problem for Lando was that his usual start problem happened again, right? That he wasn't able to get off the line well enough to protect himself against George. And as soon as he was stuck behind George, however fast he could go around the entire lap, he was never able to have enough pace at the end of the long straight to get past George Russell. In
So,
fact, I think that McLaren, with that rear wing, had the lowest top speed of all of the top four runners.
correct. Correct. And Shez, if you're McLaren, you know that Lando Norris doesn't have good starts, right? So you need to account for that. And that's my point there is to you again, you're right in saying that if Lando would have had the lead and gone off in the distance, this would have been a different thing. But you have to account for these. And we've seen 7 poles, he's only managed to keep one, right? One where he's actually led at the end of the first lap. You're the team. You have to make account for these things too. So you don't have to give him a high downforce. But again, I don't fully blame them for it. I think the weather conditions play, and these are the things that kind of happen in a season. It's going to be the case. That was a quick one. Let's move on to my fourth point, which is that where McLaren have shown vulnerability, Red Bull have put on an absolute masterclass. I think we don't talk about this enough, right? Max being Max is there. It's a given. It's true as true can be. But I think what you saw from Red Bull, and I had the chance, someone posted a transcript of the back and forth between GP and Max throughout the race. And you just see the perfect I mean, that is a masterclass in communicating, in knowing what you're doing, being decisive, being instinctive, coaching the driver. I mean, this is a goddamn it, 4 time to be champion. And you see the communication that's coming out of their pit wall. It was just fantastic. And I think you have to give a lot of credit to Red Bull for reading the race correctly. And which, I mean, Chess, can you remember a time in the last 3 years when they read a race wrong? I mean, I think back to Singapore last year where honestly they weren't even in the mix. So I think they were trying something unconventional, right? With going with the hard setup and whatnot. But I have yet to see a time where the Red Bull pit wall has screwed up. And on this day, they really won it for Max, even more, I would say, than the red flag itself. Like the way they managed that race with him, for him, was just amazing. And then it's
Yeah,
one of those underwritten, undertold things, really.
yeah. I mean, this is all about like how you use the data that you've got, because everybody essentially has the same data coming to them, and how you use that data to then dictate what you do in a race is different across different teams. And Red Bull absolutely have this. This is something that, and I've said this before. In the fallow years when Mercedes were dominating everything, and Red Bull didn't have the technical side of their game as good as it could be, they were honing their operational side. They were making sure that their pit stops were the quickest that they possibly could be, which, in brackets, ironically, they've been a bit rubbish this season on that, close brackets. But they made sure that because they didn't have the car, their strategy was absolutely on point. That it meant that every opportunity they could take, they took, so that they could win races when they shouldn't necessarily have been able to do that. And that experience, that learned behavior has carried through to now when they're dominating stuff. And that's infused within the pit wall. Hannah Schmidt is a product of that. And that's what allows them to be so quick off the mark and make decisions that you think should be 50-50, but actually they make the right calls every single time. There's no hindsight that you need to apply to it. It's always there. That little tidbit that they had Sergio Perez's Inters to look at to say that you have a bit more life left in your tires, Max. You can keep going for a bit longer. is just that little bit of data that that
But
McLaren didn't even think about. They didn't have the
that's my
opportunity
point.
to
Yeah,
do that.
exactly. That was my point in being critical of McLaren too, right? Is it's not about seeing Nico Hulkenberg on board too, but it's reading that race. You have to know as a team, and somebody's got to be doing that, by the way, because I mean, you're on with the stewards like all the time. Like somebody's actually kind of, a race director, right? One of those race engineers, race director roles. And what you saw again was absolutely no doubt in what should be done. Like that was just amazing. And the amount of trust that Max has in them, by the way, is also reflective of that, right? So they've effectively created a scenario in which Max can drive the way he needs to drive and not worry about, oh, should I be pitting? Shouldn't I be pitting? What are the tire situation? Blah, blah, blah. Like you hear none of that. And it is just
Yeah.
impeccable. So that
Yeah,
really is
especially when you
championship winning.
contrast it with the McLaren team radio, where I have to say I'm not really sure if it's a question or a statement often.
It's not, and even Ferrari too, right? If you read to a certain extent, I mean, they've gotten better on Leclerc's side now, but they kind of, I mean, and by the way, Mercedes were great at this too at their peak also. It's sort of a different style of doing it, but they kind of had that. And I
Yeah,
thought that this was sort of I would rank this as the number two thing in terms of Max winning that race because look, the outcome of the race was that he won, right? And to your point, maybe he wouldn't have been in the race had the red flags not been out. But the reality was that he would have been on the podium. They had at least managed to kind of do that. Like he would have managed to do that, and that would have been a great, an amazing
mm,
achievement in and
yeah,
of,
yeah,
of
yeah,
itself.
yeah,
So,
yeah. Don't
all right,
don't don't disagree with that. Okay, what's
all right. My
next?
final point, and my final reason why you cannot blame Lando for losing this race and the lead of and the chance to kind of close the gap in the championship is the others. The others did not show up and the others actually hurt him, right? So I mean, you go through the final results and you see the Alpines finishing ahead of Lando. That's not something that he would have wanted. Now you can take George Russell finishing ahead, or maybe even take a Leclerc finishing ahead, maybe even a Piastri finishing ahead, if that is allowed now moving forward.
Uh,
But what Lando didn't need is for the Alpines to finish on the podium, right? What he didn't need is to finish behind George Russell. And on this occasion, it kind of went his against him.
how is that not his own fault?
It's not his own fault. It has
It's
nothing. I mean,
not.
it's
So it wasn't
circumstantial.
him that outbraked himself at the second
Yeah,
safety
but I
car
mean, look,
restart into turn one and dropped himself behind Leclerc, Russell, and
I
Piastri.
agree. But as I told you, that McLaren had set up the car in a way that he wouldn't have been able to make an impression had he
Yeah,
fallen behind. So
but if he hadn't made that mistake into turn one, he
I don't
wouldn't have
know. I
fallen
mean,
behind.
if he wouldn't, even if he wouldn't have made that mistake, I mean, he still was. What was he when at that second restart? Wasn't he P5? Like it wasn't like he lost like 7 or 8 positions
No,
there.
no,
It was already
he was P4.
it was P4 or
So
P5.
it wasn't he P4 and he dropped 5, 6, 7 because he dropped behind
Okay,
Piastri
fair
even.
enough. You can put that. I mean, they also had issues with their brakes too. So I mean,
Ah, this old
okay,
nonsense.
okay. Now again, I agree with you. I'm not taking anything away from Lando. I'm just telling you why on this. Okay, this is like for
Don't buy it.
the view, the long view of the championship and why it hurts so much, right? It's not. This race happens 3 races into the season, it's fine. But I think on this occasion also, I mean, look at where the Ferraris were. I mean, they just got it wrong, coming off of back-to-back weekends where they looked dominant. Again, my pain, my goodness. 2 races, I give them my heart again, and they crush me again and again.
It's lucky they've got rid of that crashy
And look at
driver.
what Piastri did too. I mean, he looked great in sprint qualifying, but then he looked like poo poo the whole time. Like it was just crazy. And I mean, George Russell pulled it up there, but I mean, he couldn't hang on either. And by the way, if I couldn't be more sad for anyone than George Russell. This was his race to win. Honestly, it really was. You could
Should have
argue
won it.
it was his
Yeah,
race
he
to
should
win.
have won it.
And
In that dog of a car, he absolutely should have won that race.
And you could argue they had zero reason to have pitted him. I mean, what's the worst that he would have DNF, right?
Yeah,
If you're
yeah,
Mercedes, you go for it. Like you
I
have nothing
agree.
to lose. Like I don't even understand what you're doing
I
there.
completely agree with
What are
you.
you doing there? Like
Yeah,
from the race
I
being
think
so
Russell would have had that race. And
anyway,
I think that the fight between him and Max at the front would have been one
that would
to
have been
save.
amazing.
It would
Yeah.
have been brilliant to
I
watch.
genuinely don't think Max would have fought him at that point because if he knew he was going to finish ahead of Lando, I think that's all that was there. Anyway, that's hard.
I think Max had
But
the bit between his teeth and he was angry. We should talk about this, right? Because I think one of the big talking points about this, why this makes why this race was one of Max's greatest ever, why it's one of the greatest wet weather drives of all time, is because of what happened in the morning. The fact that,
And even in sprint.
I don't have a major issue with the red flag stuff, right? But he was so angry after qualifying, wasn't he? Why did it take 40 seconds to throw out a red flag? It's stupid. What is going on? Like, I don't want to keep talking about this. It's just the worst thing ever. And then Christian Horner doubling down on that afterwards. They were so angry. They was throwing stuff around the garage. And to turn that around, that he was out there to make a point in the afternoon, right? And he made that point emphatically, which is what makes that race so much more satisfying.
Yeah.
And why, like,
Well, and
even me as someone that has criticized Max in the past, like, I was so happy to see him win that race. Like,
I
he
mean,
earned it, man. It was great.
I'm 100% with you. If you're a Formula One fan, right? If your horse is not in the race, so to speak, right? And my horse wasn't, right?
No, and nor
I
was
loved
mine, to
every
be
bit of
fair.
this. I loved every bit of this because it was just amazing to see what he did there, given how their day went. And honestly, in some ways, even if you call him being a little bit lucky in the race, I think it kind of evened out, right? If you look at the day, he was kind of hard done in the morning, and then eventually by afternoon time, it kind of swings the other way. I think it's great. The one downside I have to all of this, right? The one complaint I have is, as a Formula One fan, I think these next three races become slightly less interesting now because the championship is effectively out of reach. Like, I know mathematically there's a chance, but like, you would need two max DNFs, right, to even
Yeah.
make it a fighting chance. That's
Yeah.
just
Well,
not
maybe
going to
maybe
happen.
that's what they're
That's
gonna
just not
use. Maybe that's what they're gonna use Oscar Piastri for.
they're
Um,
just going to like torpedo him off the
yeah,
track. Like,
yeah. It wouldn't be the first McLaren that's taken off the rival in turn one.
oh wow, you had to get that in there, didn't
Anyway, there was one before we leave Sao Paulo for another 12 months. I did have another bone to pick with F1 in general. That was the broadcast. So did you watch this on Sky? Did you have the Sky commentary for the
I
for the
had
race?
Scott. Yes, I'm stuck with Scott.
Man, it was awful.
Wow,
I think that was one of the worst commentaries I have ever seen.
why?
Like, first of all, they seemed bored. Like, Karun made the point that, oh, we've been up since 4:30. It's been a long day. We've had to do all this. I've listened to tidbits of Alex Jacques on F1 TV Pro, and man, they had the same timings. They had to do the commentary at the same time, but there's so much more energy. There's so much more, like,
Finally coming around to my side,
it
man.
was so much better to listen to. And the second thing that I found super, super annoying and disrespectful is, while Max is out there putting in 14 fastest laps in the last, 20 odd laps, right? They're sitting there on two separate occasions talking about, oh, but Max has to iron out the dodgy driving in give and take situations. We like him,
So
but why does he keep driving like that? It takes away his shine. And Crofty did it, and then Karun did it a bit later, and I was like, this is so unnecessary, and this is the worst time to do it. And when people are sitting there complaining about British bias, mate, this is why. It was awful. That was the worst bit of commentary I've ever heard. And what makes it even worse is that I know that if Martin Brundle had been there, that if you have all of the difficulty in understanding what's going on, the complexity of the pit stop changes and red flags and safety cars, he cuts through all of the bull crap and just puts you in the driver's seat and you understand what is going on. Karun just didn't have it today, man. Oh,
this was
on the
the
weekend, it was just so bad, so
so
bad.
I love you for saying that. I wasn't going to bring it up today, but this has exactly been my complaint about this. Like, they sounded, both of them, Crofty and Karun, just sounded so butthurt from the last 2 weeks. Who cares? To be honest, like, I mean, there's my who cares. That was criticism for that week. Park it there. Like, the next time he does that, you can bring it up. But on this day, there was absolutely no space for it. And you know who would have been nice to have in the broadcast this race? Nico Rosberg.
Nico Rosberg. Yeah,
Fantastic. I
brilliant.
don't understand.
Yeah,
Pay
it would
the
have been so
man
good.
whatever he
Yeah,
needs. Let
yeah,
him
yeah. It
broadcast
would
from
have
his
been,
home
yeah,
for
mate.
like,
It would have
like
been. It would have been
just let him
so
watch.
good.
This is what I'm saying. Like, it is just absolutely mind-boggling that they decide. And look, I agree with them that they were tired, right? But good God, I mean, say a prayer for the Williams guys, say a prayer for the Aston Martin guys. Like they're just like, good God, like this is what you're complaining about. Like I 100% agree with you. I do want to bring up one more thing. Actually, there's a couple more things. We have some time here. One, what McLaren said today, what Andrea Stella said, and sort of reflecting on the race was really bad, just really bad. Have you had the chance to read it?
Uh, Probably. What did he say?
Well, he said something to the effect of, "Well, our goal never really was to help
Oh,
win the
yeah,
championship. Like,
yeah,
we are
yeah,
focused."
yeah.
That is loser talk, man. And this is why you cannot blame Lando fully for this. Like, this is not the stuff that championship winning teams say. You might think that. You might absolutely think that, Shez,
Yeah.
but I've told you this. You do not need to put that in the press. You could have just come out and said, look, we got it wrong. The circumstances were against it. Period. End of story. You could have even just said, look, it was just a rainy day and this is kind of what happened. Ches, the mentality that they have taken this whole season, and now they've told us that they didn't really care. They have effectively worsened Lando's chances even more than this race.
Yeah.
I could argue that had they done a better job of managing Lando's championship chances a few races ago, this race would not have hurt as much. The
Hmm.
gap would have been much closer.
Yeah, maybe.
On this day, it's fine.
But
They were unlucky, but good God, you don't say this stuff. Don't
yeah,
say it.
but it just tells you that they never really believed in Lando. Anyway, I think that's that's
Okay, then
that's
that's fine.
that's where that's where
You
I
still
think
don't say
the
that.
statement. Yeah, no, I agree. It was
And
yeah,
and
it
you're good
was
at building fast cars, but you're really sucky when it comes to making pit wall decisions. Like, and this is also a bit of a cop
well,
out, Chess, to say that, oh, we were only trying to like. What do you mean by that? Oh, I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. I mean, yeah,
even
yeah.
if
You
you
can
want to blame Lando for
absolutely.
losing his race, you as a team have given away. I mean, this should have been a 1-2 for you guys. Like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't understand. Like,
Yeah, you can definitely break McLaren down into make fast cars, cannot race them. Like that's the problem.
that's just it.
They
You
can,
sound you
yeah,
sound
they can,
idiotic. Like,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
not what you
yeah,
do.
yeah.
All right, so then on that bombshell, this is our wrap-up view of the Brazilian Grand Prix Part 1 because there are 15 storylines and there's going to be more
Ah,
to talk about in the lead up to Las Vegas. As always, please subscribe, please leave us a comment. We try to read each and every comment. We try to respond to as many as we can, and we will see you in the next episode.
boom.